In June 1629, when the Dutch ship Batavia struck a coral reef in the middle of the Indian Ocean just before dawn, no one on board knew that this moment would turn into an experiment in humanity itself. The sound of the impact tore through the silence of the night like an explosion. The wooden hull cracked, the masts shook, and seawater began to flood the cargo holds. In the darkness, people collided with one another, shouting, children crying, sailors desperately clinging to ropes. In that moment, everyone shared a single thought: survival. And ironically, surviving this first disaster would become the most innocent moment of everything that followed. Batavia was one of the pride ships of the Dutch East India Company, part of the trade network stretching from Europe to Asia. The ship carried silver ingots, valuable goods, weapons, and immense wealth. But its true cargo was human. Nearly 300 people, soldiers, sailors, officers, and among them women, children, and families. Some believed they were heading toward a new life. Others were simply doing their duty. None of them knew how far from humanity they would soon drift. After the ship broke apart, the survivors reached the Houtman Abrolhos Islands off the coast of Australia. On maps, these islands appeared as small dots. In reality, they were extremely inhospitable. Fresh water was almost non-existent. The soil was sandy. There were no trees, no shade. Scorching sun during the day, harsh winds at night. Their connection to civilization was completely severed. The first days passed in the shock of survival. The wounded were carried. Whatever could be salvaged from the wreckage was collected. People tried to stay together because togetherness still carried a sense of hope. Everyone believed the same thing. The Dutch East India Company would search for them. A ship would come. This was a waiting period, a short wait. But during this waiting period, something slowly began to take shape on the islands. Order was dissolving. Because order requires leadership, and a leadership vacuum is always dangerous. The ship's captain and several senior officers left the islands in search of help. When they departed, there appeared to be some form of order left behind, but it was hollow. Military hierarchy had collapsed. There was no one giving orders, no one holding anyone accountable. And within this void, a quiet man stepped forward, Jeronimus Cornelisz. Cornelisz was not an ordinary sailor. He was educated, intelligent, but he also carried deep anger. He harbored hatred toward authority, religion, and order itself. Even during the voyage, he had been watched with suspicion because of his ideas. But now no one was stopping him. Cornelisz observed people carefully. Who was afraid? Who was strong? Who was alone? Who was desperate? Step by step, he advanced. First, he made small decisions. Then he began dividing people into groups. You will stay here. You will go to another island. At first, these decisions seemed reasonable because everyone wanted to survive. But soon, something else began on the islands. Selection. Decisions were being made about who would live and who would die. At first, these deaths were accidents. Someone died of thirst. Someone drowned. Someone disappeared. But then knives began to speak. People were killed in their sleep at night. Some were taken away to distant islands and left to their fate. Women and children were not spared from the violence. Cornelisz deliberately used fear. He turned people against one another and built a system where no one trusted anyone else. This was not chaos. This was not panic. This was deliberate rule. For months, people on the islands were killed by other people. Bodies were buried in the sand, thrown into the sea. Some were never found. Those who survived lived in silence, because to speak was to die. But every dark system contains a fracture. On one of the islands, a small group of soldiers rejected Cornelis's authority. They had almost nothing, but they managed to stay together. Despite hunger and thirst, they did not fall apart. And over time, they understood just how deadly Cornelis's system truly was. When the rescue ship finally reached the islands months later, the scene was far more than the aftermath of a shipwreck. Very few people were still alive. What they told was recorded, read in courtrooms. The ways people had been killed were written down one by one. Jeronimus Cornelisz was captured, put on trial, and executed. But the Batavia disaster does not end here, because this story is not merely a tragedy that occurred in 1629. It is a record of the darkest side of human nature, a demonstration of where people can drift when authority disappears and rules collapse. Batavia teaches us this: nature can kill, hunger can consume, thirst can break a person, but uncontrolled power turns humans into monsters. And that is why Batavia remains disturbing centuries later, because this story does not belong only to the past. Under the right conditions, any society can become Batavia. What happened on those silent islands stands as one of the darkest mirrors in history. As days passed, life on the islands turned from a struggle to survive into a state of waiting. People no longer thought about rescue. They thought about when their turn would come. Cornelis's rule was silent but absolute. No one shouted. No one openly rebelled, because fear is more effective than shouting. And Cornelisz understood this very well. Each morning, the first thing people did upon waking was check whether they were still alive. They listened for the breathing of the person beside them, because during the night, someone else might have disappeared. To disappear on the islands meant to die. But even death was not the same for everyone. Some were killed quickly. Some were left without water. Others were destroyed slowly in front of everyone else. For Cornelisz, this was a matter of order. He had his own logic. To him, these islands were a place where God separated people. The strong would live, the weak would be eliminated, and he placed himself at the center of this selection. People killed on his command. This gave him a sense of invulnerability. For women on the islands, time moved more slowly. They lived not only with hunger and thirst, but with constant threat. Cornelis's men began to see women as resources. This was one of the darkest faces of the Batavia disaster. Some women were taken by force. Some tried to resist. Those who resisted usually did not survive. Children, meanwhile, were silent, very silent. Children sense fear before adults do. They learned not to cry. They learned to hide. But this did not save them. In Cornelis's system, age, innocence, or suffering meant nothing. On one of the islands, however, a different story was unfolding. The small group of soldiers Cornelisz had sent away managed to survive against all odds. They found fresh water. They learned to fish. Most importantly, they stayed together. For them, survival was not a show of power, but an act of resistance. Over time, whispers from the other islands reached this group. Stories of people being killed, children disappearing, women being held by force. These soldiers realized that waiting was no longer enough. If Cornelis's system was not stopped, there might be no one left alive even if rescue arrived. And for the first time, the idea of real resistance was born on the islands. This resistance was not a grand uprising, it was quiet, planned, it advanced in small steps. Cornelis's men were lured into traps. Some were neutralized, some fled. The balance of power began to shift for the first time. By the time Cornelisz realized he was losing control, it was already too late. When the rescue ship appeared on the horizon, months of nightmare had already unfolded on the islands. What the rescuers found was not merely the remains of a shipwreck, but evidence of a systematic crime against humanity. Bodies, testimonies, witness accounts. Everything was recorded, entered into court records, written into history. When Cornelisz was put on trial, he offered no defense. He showed no remorse. In his own mind, he had been right, but history rejected his logic. He was executed, yet the number of people who died on the islands far exceeded the punishment he received. This is why the Batavia disaster is not an ordinary maritime accident. It is a document of what humans can do to other humans. And this story does not truly end, because Batavia is not a perversion locked in the past. When authority collapses, when rules disappear, when fear takes control, every society moves closer to Batavia. That is why this story is disturbing, because no one wants to see themselves reflected in this mirror. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. See you again on our next journey.